I'm Sam Zakharoff. I teach here at the law school. Let me try to frame how we're going to do this. So in the past 6 months or so, I've been giving a lot of talks in private settings about what to expect from the American election that took place a week ago. One of the points I made in all of these talks was to say that between the end of 2023 and the end of 2024, the world will have seen 85 major elections that have shaped the governing coalitions of basically all the democratic countries, or almost all the democratic countries in the world. And there are three characteristics that have played themselves out across these elections thus far. The first is, with the sole exception of Mexico, tremendous anti-incumbent anger and the quite remarkable electoral defeat of the incumbent party in country after country after country, sometimes from the left, sometimes from the right, but that's the unifying message. The second thing that happened in all these elections, and again, there's a couple of exceptions, but the second thing that happened is, despite many years, much of it inspired by what occurred in the United States in 2020, despite many years of systemic assaults on the integrity and capacity of election administration, specifically independent election administration, in country after country, the electoral systems held, which was also quite remarkable. So with the unique exception of Mali, and with the exception of clearly non-democratic states like Iran and Venezuela, basically what we got was pretty good, pretty fair elections in which the prevailing party actually got the most votes, and no significant disputes about this anywhere in the world. And the third thing that happened was that we had very little sense of what got voted in country after country. Why is that? It's because the traditional parties of democracy have fallen apart in the established democratic countries. The Christian Democrats don't exist in Italy anymore. The socialists don't exist in France anymore. Germany is governed, or was until very recently, governed by a very unstable coalition government. And so what we are getting is massive political realignments in every democratic country, sometimes organized around populists, sometimes organized around lone individuals who are charismatic. My home country of Argentina is an example of that, someone with no political base who manages to prevail electorally. And as we start to slice and dice the results from the elections last week, what we see is that kind of realignment in the United States as well. And we can say with a fair degree of certainty that the electoral base coalition that propelled Trump to victory in 2024 is not the same as the one that propelled him to victory in 2016. We are getting a reshuffling of the deck among the political parties. We don't know how it's going to play out, which means we have a great deal of uncertainty about how this is all going to unfold in the future. Now, I would suggest that we are seeing exactly the same three features in the United States that we've seen in the other democratic countries. And I know that the United States is different because we're important and they're not. I understand that there are certain myopias from this country, but I would start by just encouraging you to think, like, why is it that the pattern seems to hold and what we have in the United States looks very much like what is happening in the rest of the world? And so what we're going to do today is turn to the third of these features, which is, what is it that we can expect at this point? What's coming down the pike? What does it look like? And we have not tried to have, in the inimitable words of Fox News, a fair and balanced panel. What we have done is taken people with real knowledge about the inner workings of critical areas of the American political and legal life who will say, okay, what's at play? What's the real risk factors here? And so let me introduce briefly our panelists. I'm not going to give their full titles and all that, but Deborah Archer, you should all know, faculty member here, associate dean here, and also president of the American Civil Liberties Union. So there's a lot of hats there that, are important. Vanita Gupta, who is, you can all see, I take, okay, great. Vanita is one of our alums. Until recently, she was Associate Attorney General of the United States. She's now teaching for us in our Washington program. And it's just great to have you with us. And finally, we have Ryan Goodman, who you should all also know is a professor here, teaches many things involving national security and foreign affairs, and also worked for a couple of years as special counsel in the Department of Defense 10 years ago. So the topics that we're going to move across initially, and then we'll have questions and exchanges, but Deborah's going to, not surprisingly, take up civil rights, civil liberties first, and then I'm going to ask Vanita to weigh in on the administration of the state. How's that for a capacious title for that you can fit anything you want into? And then Ryan will take up questions of foreign relations and national security. And so, Deborah, why don't you start?
Yeah, thank you for inviting me to join the panel. And talking about the threats to civil rights and civil liberties is such a broad topic as well, so I'll try to hit a few of highlights doesn't seem like the right word, but then look forward to the discussions. And I think that the concern is that a second Trump administration is going to pose real serious risks to civil rights and civil liberties, and anticipate that it'll be disastrous for some of our most fundamental freedoms and rights. I've had a lot of these conversations with folks over the past several days, and they often say that they don't think it's going to be as bad as we say it's going to be. And I understand why some people don't think it's going to be that bad, and I honestly hope that they're right, but I also think that we can't act like this is normal, that this is going to be a regular push and pull between Republicans and Democrats, that it's going to be kind of politics as usual. We need to take his words seriously and the threats that those words represent seriously. So based on what Trump has said and that his supporters have said, I think there are some real concerns around civil rights and civil liberties that run from a range of things that can happen pretty easily to some that will be much harder for the administration to accomplish. And I'm going to start with some of the harms that I put on the side of can happen pretty easily. And those are harms that are going to happen well beyond whether or not a policy is successful. So even if some Trump proposals are ultimately successfully challenged, I don't think we can understate the harm and the impact and the fear that is going to kind of wash over marginalized people and marginalized communities, regardless of whether or not those policies are successful and while those policies are being challenged. And at the end of the day, it's going to be impossible to erase the harm that people and families and communities are going to suffer because they're going to be pushing forward some of these policies. Another overarching harm that I think we'll experience regardless of the ultimate success of any policies in civil rights and civil liberties is an increase in harassment and hate crimes. I think Trump has given a green light to some pretty hateful rhetoric. And we know that when the federal government or when the president or other leaders attack a group of people, then others join in and do the same. And I'm sure that we're going to see individuals and local governments and state governments join in some of that rhetoric. I'm sure that you all saw reports of emails that went out over the weekend to Black college students telling them that they had been selected to pick cotton at the nearest plantation and giving them instructions to report to their cotton picking assignments. We also have, the FBI is looking into those. We also have seen reports of widespread emails and texts to people threatening them with deportation and again, kind of invoking slavery as the result of this election. The day after the election, I received a voicemail on my NYU voicemail telling me that my N-word house was going to burn. And I've received several similar emails and voicemails since then, and imagine that that will increase. Hate crime surged more than 20% under Trump's first administration. Hate-motivated violence and murders spiked to record highs. So I think what we've seen in the past week is just the tip of the iceberg. So very quickly, I want to flag a few things that could happen pretty easily without much resistance or much work. First, we could see some quick reversals on Biden administration positions on several current SCOTUS cases. One that pops to mind is U.S. versus Scometti, where it's anticipated that Trump will reverse sides in this challenge to Tennessee's ban on gender-affirming care for transgender minors. And so they will come into office and reverse positions and kind of moot out that case. On abortion, we could see the withdrawal of medical abortion drug mifepristone from the market pretty easily and quickly. Following the Students for Fair Admission versus Harvard case, we had seen some wins in other cases that were trying to challenge the military academy's use of affirmative action. But the administration can certainly end that by just changing the policies that military academies are using around admissions. I think we'll very quickly see launches of investigations of colleges and universities and K through 12 schools that are engaged in DEI work or to threaten to revoke their federal funds. And I also think we'll see reverse, of course, on several programs that have been effective in challenging segregation and inequality and that advanced community equity across the country. So one, for example, is reversing course on the requirement under the Fair Housing Act to work to affirmatively further fair housing. I think we'll see changes in the Department of Transportation's infrastructure program. Under the bipartisan infrastructure bill, there were lots of efforts to what people are calling rebuild communities, particularly communities of color that had been harmed and destroyed, that had been segregated and sequestered by infrastructure projects. Most of those funds haven't been distributed. Most of that work has not been done yet. And I think we'll see reverse course on that. And I think we'll see some changes to approaches to reforming policing that the Biden administration had been engaged in around the country. And again, all of these things would do real damage to individuals, to families, to communities, and they can happen pretty easily. On the longer term horizon, I just want to hit a few before Sam tells me I'm done. But again, civil rights and civil liberties is a broad topic. In the racial justice front, I think the Trump campaign has promised that we can expect efforts to reverse gains in racial justice. So again, a second Trump administration would abandon efforts to advance DEI policies within the military, within federal minority contracting programs, and other programs at the federal level that had worked to open up opportunity. I think we're going to see litigation or investigation of universities that have maintained some level of racial diversity on their student body or on their faculty. I'm on the board of a college, and they've seen some threats because they have a relative stable number of Black students and other students of color after the SFFA decision. And so the argument is that you couldn't have gotten those numbers unless you're still using race. I think we'll see litigation challenging universities and law schools and other schools where the faculty is relatively diverse. We see an example at the university, at the law school at Northwestern Law School, where they're suing because they say there's just too many Black faculty, even though the Black faculty there are a very small number. On the regulatory side, I think a second Trump administration will refuse to enforce civil rights regulations on behalf of historically marginalized groups, but they'll also take actions to weaken protections in housing and education, in healthcare, and again, in the category that I would call community equity. He's promised to increase his attacks on so-called divisive concepts. And so I think we would see federal funding withdrawn from schools that have curricula or books or classes that address race and racism, gender and sexuality. one thing that people aren't talking about, there's a lot of discussion about potential attacks on HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities, and the funding that they receive from the federal government. So the argument is that they should lose their federal funding because they're engaged in racial discrimination against white people, or they wouldn't have majority Black student bodies. In particular, Howard University Law School, which is a HBCU law school, has a class that is 89% Black. The next closest HBCU law school has about 55% Black student body. And Howard is on notice that they may be challenged because the only way you can have a law school class that is 89% Black is to engage in racial discrimination. On the immigration front, one thing is clear is that Trump can accomplish his immigration agenda, which includes mass deportations and detentions, a promised return to family separation without violating the Constitution and federal laws. On the LGBTQ front, I think we can expect a second Trump administration to weaponize federal law to override state-level protections for LGBTQ folks and to mandate discrimination against them by schools and healthcare providers. I think that includes banning gender-affirming medical care. They could stop school districts from maintaining trans-inclusive policies by arguing that violates the rights of cisgender students under Title IX, ban transgender women from sports. And we've seen what that looks like around the country as states have taken efforts to target transgender kids and their families. On the abortion front, I think we'll see them try to use the Comstock Act to effectively ban abortion in all 50 states. Close advisors of Donald Trump have repeatedly said that they don't need to enact a federal abortion ban because they have the Comstock Act, and I think they'll move that forward. And then finally, on the protest front, he's promised to weaponize the federal government and the military against protesters and political opponents. Last week, we saw a bill just proposed before the House that I think serves as a model of what is to come. The bill would give the Secretary of the Treasury unilateral authority to revoke nonprofit status of any organization that's believed to be supporting terrorism. And I think that that can be used to be weaponized against organizations that he views as enemies. And so a specific example are organizations that focus on Palestine, like Students for Justice in Palestine. When DeSantis in Florida attempted to ban Students for Justice in Palestine at Florida campuses, he said it was because they were supporting terrorism. And so you can see that argument being used with this kind of legislation. But then it would take another step and target organizations like the ACLU, who represent organizations like Students for Justice in Palestine to protect their First Amendment rights. So you can see the harm there, the potential harm there. They could also weaponize the IRS against nonprofit organizations and individuals, the Department of Labor against nonprofit organizations and individuals. And at the ACLU, we're certainly preparing for that eventuality. So I'm gonna end there and hope to get some more questions.
Okay, so Vanita, why don't you take us to the administration perspective, that is, from somebody who had to look at these policies from the top position in the Justice Department, and what you see as points of resistance or remedies or threats from the domain you know so well.
Sure. And I'm sorry I can't be there in person, but glad that you are having this conversation. So just by way of kind of situating my perspective, I was head of the Civil Rights Division when President Trump was first elected in 2017 for his first term, and had to usher in kind of in my last day at the Department of Justice in that role was January 19th, 2017. And so much of what Deborah is talking about is obviously very resonant. I think I want to focus, before I get to some of the specific issues, on the fact that when I came into the Biden administration as Associate AG, the rebuilding of norms that had to take place. And that while we are anticipating, and every administration has a political policy prerogative to, change and alter policies. I think what is most concerning about what we are hearing and what, the campaign was about and what now transition officials are talking about in the Trump administration upcoming are some of the structural changes. And I think these are things that may not be top of mind right now, but are going to have a broad impact on all of the issues that Deborah has talked about. So let me start with the courts. When President Trump left office after his first 4 years, he had appointed already a historic number. It was more than a quarter of currently active federal judges are Trump administration appointees. He had gone so fast that he had basically doubled what President Obama had achieved in 8 years. He had accomplished in 4 years. So we have to now understand that another 4 years of a Trump administration, particularly with a Republican Senate, where they will be able to move very quickly, what exactly that is going to mean for the judiciary and the impact on every single issue that Deborah and others have been talking about, right? So that is a very foundational thing that I think as law students you are confronting, and as lawyers who may have kind of seen themselves as leading the resistance in 2017, the courts have now become less and less hospitable to civil rights enforcement, to recognizing precedent, as we all saw in the kind of Dobbs decision, and most recently the undermining of the administrative state and the latest evisceration of Chevron, et cetera. And so that is a thing that is very top of mind for any civil rights lawyer, including myself, but also I think folks who have been involved in understanding the importance of the administrative state in the regulatory kind of aspects of government. There's also separately been a lot of talk about a tax on the civil service. And I just recently, any of you may have seen today, Mark Paoletta, who's on DOJ transition for the Trump administration, what he has said about if career employees at the Justice Department don't get with President Trump's program, they, are facing being fired. Now, civil service has been kind of is at the foundation of the federal government. The Justice Department is an agency that has over 110,000 employees. They serve really the American public, the United States government, and they serve regardless of administration. And part of the reason to have civil service protection is that the line attorneys in the Justice Department who are making prosecution decisions, they're making civil litigation decisions, both affirmative and defensive, is that they are supposed to be making these decisions free from political interference and fear or favor about the positions they are taking. That is the interpretation of the Constitution and federal law. But this notion that civil service protection will be gone, or that there will be retribution and retaliation for people in the civil service, which is meant to be an apolitical, non-political function, is something that I think, and I imagine, is creating a lot of alarm inside the machinery of the federal government. And it fundamentally alters what is kind of people's perceptions about what federal government lawyering is supposed to entail and what it means to represent the interests of the United States and upholding the Constitution. I would also say that when you look at a lot of the executive orders I would anticipate that day one, all of President Biden's, or almost all of them, of his executive orders are going to be rescinded, and President Trump will reestablish the executive orders from his first term, but also certainly right now, I'm sure his transition team is working on a whole new set of executive orders that will be announced in the first day and the first weeks. Those will be probably aligned with all of the policy priorities that one can anticipate: undermining environmental protections, policing reform, voting rights reforms, et cetera. President Biden had to accomplish much of his agenda through executive orders because Congress was not enacting laws. That same would apply for all of the kind of executive orders to ensure federal law protections post Dobbs on reproductive freedom and reproductive health care access. And so we can anticipate many of them have already been held up in court. In fact, in my second kind of foray in the Justice Department was very revelatory in terms of the fact that executive orders on the very same topics that were never met with a court challenge in the Obama administration were almost immediately challenged in the Biden administration in courts that were much more kind of willing to undermine and attack based on new legal interpretations, et cetera. And so many of his executive orders were already held up in court, but we can see and imagine what the kind of immediate rescission will be in announcement of new executive orders. I'm also deeply concerned about this notion of, the weaponization of federal law enforcement and having a list of political enemies to go after. This is not something that we should take lightly, and it is something that has been a theme. And in fact, the Biden administration Justice Department was accused of being a weaponized institution. We've all heard of the kind of increased politicization and anger and polarization around the Justice Department, and I suspect that this notion that the president has a list and all of the talk about this, while I hope it is exaggerated, we are going to wait and see what all that means for the machinery of the federal government, and especially in light of the Supreme Court's Trump versus United States decision this past summer. What are the guardrails for the president? What is the relationship between the White House and the Justice Department, which has been reestablished, where the White House is not supposed to have any engagement or influence on especially criminal prosecutions. It certainly feels like that was already being corroded in that decision in so many fundamental ways that alter our notions of both separation of powers, but also the kind of importance of norms between the White House and the Justice Department. And that now there is a much more kind of open forum for the president to more kind of directly, literally direct actions at the Justice Department. So there's a lot more to talk about here. I will say, and this may be getting back to something positive here, which is that there had been a lot of work to protect our democracy and our elections and voting access, et cetera. And I'm very proud of the incredible work of organizations all over the country that came together to do their part for this election to protect voter access and prevent election sabotage. But I certainly think there's a lot of cause for concern around what norms are going to be upheld. What are norms anyway? Given kind of some of these structural issues that we are now going to be confronting very seriously and head on.
Thank you. I think that sets up the table for Ryan. If I could just interject a sense that we go through elections that are increasingly apocalyptic in their tone, and it's very hard in anticipation to figure out what is really existential that's at stake and what is merely a matter of elections have consequences. There are going to be things that if you're on one side of the aisle, you're not going to like. If your guys lose and you're on the other side, if you all lose, you're not going to like that either. And but I guess perhaps because I grew up during the Cold War period, I've always thought that the real existential ones were the international ones, and having in the last few months spent extended periods in both Taiwan and Germany, the consequences of the American election feel much more immediate and dramatic at that level. So maybe that's what you want to talk about, Ryan?
Sure.
Or if you don't, then you don't get any time.
That's right. So I do see my remit as being about national security and foreign policy, and do want to talk about that, which also includes different uses of the U.S. military domestically, in my mind. And I think for me, I'm looking at particular kinds of indicators to determine how soon we can tell the direction that this will all go in, and how badly it might go in one direction versus another, especially since we have one-party control now in DC of all three, of the two political branches, and then a very receptive Supreme Court to their policy and ideological outlook. So one of the indicators I'll talk about a bit about are potential appointments and nominees that have already been mentioned. Another indicator is what the confirmation process might look like, and if there'll be anything in terms of meaningful congressional checks and balances. One of the deepest concerns is that with a very sizable margin in the Senate, that President-elect Trump has already said that he wants to use the recess appointments to get around Senate approval. So it does give us a concern that he would in fact put in nominees that wouldn't even acquire the consent of his own party. John Thune, just in the last couple hours, was voted in as the next Senate Majority Leader, which I do think does give some greater hope of congressional checks and balances, at least vis-a-vis one of his particular opponents in that race. He wrote an op-ed recently, just before the leadership vote, in which, in reflection in part what Sam was saying about the reshuffling of the parties, he said that he referred to the, quote, multi-ethnic, multiracial coalition, quote, that voted in their leadership and President Trump, and he said, quote, "We cannot afford to take this coalition for granted. If we fail to deliver on President Trump's priorities, we will lose their support. They have trusted us with their votes. Now we have to roll up our sleeves and get to work," end quote. So there, to me, is maybe one of the possibilities for some leverage, if that's true, in what he believes they have to do as a matter of policy. When there was the second impeachment on January 6th, Senator Thune voted to acquit. He said he voted to acquit because the impeachment power is to primarily to remove somebody from office. And he said, quote, "What former President Trump did to undermine faith in our election system and disrupt the peaceful transfer of power is inexcusable," end quote. So there's some positive indicator there. Another indicator is the responsiveness of the media institutions. I think a very serious concern is what Jeff Bezos did by deep sixing what was going to be a endorsement of Kamala Harris in the presidential race, and what many refer to as anticipatory obedience to anti-democratic power. On the other hand, in the last 48 hours, the Wall Street Journal editorial board has written an editorial saying that they, in some ways, caution against President Trump implementing the most expansive versions of the deportation policies that he's otherwise proposed on the campaign trail. So my concerns are about two areas that I'll talk about. One is use of the Insurrection Act to get the military to suppress civil unrest in our country, and use of the military, including detention facilities, to engage in massive deportation of people inside the United States, if it's even needed for President Trump to invoke the Insurrection Act. He didn't do it last time because his Secretary of Defense objected, but I think this time around he might feel emboldened. And that the Insurrection Act could be used with immigration powers to go after not just people who are inside the United States without documentation, but also those who are lawfully present. In fact, they'd be the easiest targets because they're documented and the US government knows where they are. The Haitian migrants in Ohio, in Springfield, Ohio, are legally present, and Donald Trump went after them and said that he would deport them. In the last Trump administration, they also engage in efforts to denaturalize people. And Stephen Miller, who's coming into the White House, has said that they will they'll put that policy on steroids, essentially, when they come back in. So in terms of appointments, I think it's concerning in that regard that the ex-ICE director, Tom Homan, is going to go into the White House without needing Senate approval as the borders are. He has recently said, since the statement that he will be coming to the White House, that they will be going after people in the United States who are here having committed crimes. And then he says one of those crimes is crossing the border. That happens to be a misdemeanor, but that's his view. Ken Cuccinelli wrote the chapter on the DHS for Project 2025, and also wrote a very, very detailed and long policy brief in which he refers not only to the use of the Insurrection Act and the US military to enforce the border against drug cartels and criminal cartels, but he also then says, as well, the invaders, and by invaders he means people who, he says it, are people who cross the border illegally. So one can imagine what direction that would go, especially with Kristi Noem now being picked as the person who would serve as the Secretary of DHS if she is approved. Then in my domain, in the DoD, in the last 24 hours, Trump has said that he will nominate Fox News personality Pete Hegseth. I think that's the best description of him. He did serve, he served as a junior officer in the U.S. Army. He's never led a big organization. He's never had a role in national security policy making or the like. He says that he was in fact in the U.S. Army National Guard to protect the incoming President Biden at the inauguration, but was removed from the National Guard because of tattoos he has that are associated with far-right extremists. He has also referred to liberals in the United States as the enemies within, quote, from his book, while the post-9/11 generation of patriots spent 2 decades fighting enemies abroad, we allowed America's domestic enemies at home to gobble up cultural, political, and spiritual territory, quote. He also refers in his new book to, quote, Antifa, BLM, now Hamas supporters, and other progressive stormtroopers have done their best to create little Samars, the Iraqi town I was deployed in the center of cities like Portland, Chicago, Minneapolis. So a big concern would be, what would this individual, who seems very loyal to Trump but has no real qualifications matching anybody who's ever sat in that seat, as far as I know, do when a president says, I want to invoke the Insurrection Act? Also, what will he do in foreign policy? He has said that he thinks that the United States should target Iranian cultural sites, and he said it with some information. He in fact said it in terms of, and we should change the laws of war in order to do that. So he knows it's a violation of laws of war, yet he says that. So also just think about the downstream effects of that kind of a decision to put somebody like that in place, what it would do to recruitment, which is a problem for the U.S. military in terms of trying to get recruiting new people into the military. If they think somebody who's been excluded based on the potential associations with far-right extremists and white supremacists, what's that going to do to recruitment? Who will not apply and who will apply? On Ukraine and NATO, I think NATO is one of the biggest concerns because John Bolton has said that he believes that Donald Trump would try to pull out of NATO. On Ukraine, I'll have a little bit of a positive note there. It is true that in the first Trump administration, Trump authorized the sending of Javelin missiles, which is very provocative at the time to Ukraine to defend themselves against Russia, even though he had, for his own transactional purposes, first held them up in order to try to get Ukraine to conduct a sham investigation of his opponent, Joe Biden. But he did then authorize separately Javelin missiles. The person he has picked, Michael Waltz, a member of the House, to serve as its national security advisor, recently gave an interview November 2nd and November 4th with NPR, and recently wrote in an op-ed in The Economist in terms that are very strongly in support of Ukraine in many respects. He in fact says in The Economist that if Putin does not come to the table and refuses to talk, we should, quote, provide more weapons to Ukraine with fewer restrictions on their use. Faced with this pressure, Mr. Putin will probably take the opportunity to wind the conflict down. In the NPR interview, he also says, we'll get Putin to the table. We have leverage, like taking the handcuffs off the long-range weapons we provided Ukraine as well. So I do think there's some possibility of some hope in that regard, though I do worry tremendously about the state of the world and military alliances otherwise.
So let me pose a question to all of you, because Vanita made the point that increasingly government in the United States is done through executive decrees and through administrative action and not through legislation, which means there's more capacity to flip from one administration to the other. And so there is more volatility in American public policy. Were we here in 2017, we would have had a conversation much like this that went through with the rhetorical flourishes of Trump as a candidate and his promises upon coming in. And by and large, the calling card of the first Trump administration was incompetence. They just didn't get very much done. It was sort of the saving grace was that Trump was disinterested in and the administration was at war with itself. And what I'm hearing is that there may be more competent people coming in earlier on. It took them a long time to form an administration the first time around. And that gives rise to the question of what tools that lawyers use in these times. Between 2017 and 2021, I had a number of students come to my office wanting to do papers on the propriety and the legal certainty of the nationwide injunction issued by one district court judge somewhere in the country. Shockingly, beginning in January 21, I have not had a single student come to my office wanting to write that paper. I suspect they will soon be back. Between 21 and 25, we again heard demands for the abolition of the filibuster, so that the Biden administration in those periods where it had a Senate majority, which it could push through things much more quickly. The filibuster now seems a source of protection, and may be the reason that there's an attempt to bypass the formal confirmation process. Are these tools still basically on the shelf? How do you see, for example, the nationwide injunction against various policies? Deborah, this is right up your alley.
It is. I was actually going to defer to Vanita first.
Okay, Vanita.
I see she was ready.
Well, let me just say that I think Congress may actually be quite active in these first 2 years. The president it's a Republican trifecta. I think the politics of all of this have changed. They are not what they were in 2017. I think that President Trump has a much stronger hold on the Senate and the House, and you can see that even by his tweet on Sunday saying that, a Senate Majority Leader shouldn't think of becoming a Senate Majority Leader if he is not going to fast track or even recess appoint my nominees, et cetera. And so I would envision actually that Congress is going to be much more active these 2 years. I am
Can I
somebody,
just push back on that, Vanita?
Yeah.
Because one of our experiences was that it's easier to mobilize the American political parties, which are like their counterparts around the world, quite weak right now. It's easier to mobilize them in opposition. It's very hard, as you know from your last gig, that it's very hard to mobilize them in support of something when you have a fractious coalition underlying it. So you really think that they are solid enough to push through legislation?
I think they are much more solid in 24 than they were in 17. I don't mean to say that they're gonna, pass 12 laws in their first year, but I think that when people talk to me about 24 and trying to draw lessons from 2017, I just think the context is completely different. And so I would expect that there are going to be some issues that are going to unite Republicans in a way because in part of the president's kind of much greater hold. I think nobody is denying, I know there's still votes that remain to be counted, but like the fact that he won the popular vote and what that means for Republicans in Congress. And so I just think the dynamics have changed. And I think that we can expect that Congress might actually pass some laws in these first 2 years, as fractious as the coalition might be. That said, we'll see. I'm also, though, about these tools of nationwide injunctions, as somebody who was overseeing the civil division and civil rights division at the Justice Department for the last 4 years, and seeing the power of a single federal judge. Mostly these cases were being filed by conservative state AGs in Texas with 2 to 3, in 2 to 3 judges' courtrooms. I am not somebody who thinks that you can just argue for the use of a tool in one administration versus another. I think that nationwide injunctions people really need to interrogate that tool very seriously, because everything that we do has ramifications in different administrations. And was a tool that was very effectively deployed to block much of President Biden's agenda, from student debt reforms to a whole range of other issues. I'm also not naive. I led the leadership conference on civil and human rights through the Trump administration from the outside. And any number of policies were held up in his administration by these nationwide injunctions. But I just think that we have to be honest with ourselves about what these tools do in kind of in administrations where we may agree with more of the policies than not. And it is hard for us to argue with any level of integrity around reforming them when in one administration versus another. That said, there's a much bigger conversation that I don't want to get into right here about the filibuster and its pros and cons. And I have feelings about that right now. But I know that advocates who may have found themselves on one side of a particular issue and a particular use of a tool may now be find themselves on the other side. And I just think as lawyers, we have to just be very serious about understanding that our arguments can't completely flip on these structural questions, that we have to have some integrity about when we are advocating for them versus not. There's a lot of room for structural reform, and I will be at the front of the line to advocate for them, but I just think we have to be honest with ourselves.
Well, I think at the very least, there will be much less tourism to scenic downtown Amarillo for a few years now. But so, Deborah, what about that? I mean, you are head of the ACLU. The ACLU sought and obtained quite a number of, in some instances, ex parte TROs on a nationwide basis. In the last Trump administration, are certain tools off the table?
Yeah, I'm glad that Vanita went first. I don't have much to add, but I would say first on the advocacy and reforming those tools. When people were talking about reforming the nationwide injunction filibuster, people were talking about reforms to the Supreme Court. One caution was that the winds do switch, and so the reforms that you think will work in your favor may work against you, and to be careful, because as you make reforms, power shifts, and the other side is going to make reforms as well that will not be to your benefit. And so we're seeing some of that play out now. I agree that we have to be careful about kind of flipping sides and having made arguments against kind of nationwide injunctions and now want to use them. But the ACLU has employed them, as you've said. I think that when we are facing the kind of crisis around civil rights and civil liberties that we are facing, that all the tools should be on the table, that all legal tools, all legal avenues should be on the table. One of the challenges that we'll face is, I think, folks who are interested in protecting civil rights and civil liberties and some of the, voting rights and our democracy, is that we have to use a different playbook than we're used to, that we have to come at these issues in a different way. We have to build different coalitions. So personally, I'm not opposed to exploring all legal options on the table to try to fight and protect in the best way that we can. But I also just want to flag that I don't want this conversation to just be about the tools that we have at a federal level. I think that that's a mistake that we've made for a very long time. And that at least post-COVID, we should realize more effectively the power that we have in states, and that the power that local governments have to protect individuals, to protect communities, to protect families. And more of our conversation should be about how in this moment are we building a firewall to protect civil rights and civil liberties using state law, using local laws, embodying our values in state and local laws. And the way that we can, I'm not at all saying abandon the courts. I could not be up here at a law school being a part of the ACLU saying that the court, including the federal court, should not be a part of our defense, but also thinking about ways that we're moving beyond the courtroom to address some of these challenges.
Can I jump in?
Yeah.
Could I just jump in on that?
Sure.
'Cause Deborah said some really important things that I want to really lift up, which is, I think the importance of the center of gravity going to the states is vital, and people, state AGs are an important office, and court litigation is going to be an important avenue for for protecting civil rights and civil liberties. And, I do think there's this tendency sometimes at, national top 10 law schools to push students to national organizations. And I love the ACLU, having been an employee there, and the ACLU actually has state and national, which is part of its power. But we tend to sometimes forget that there is so much kind of power to be built at the state level. And I do think litigation has been too much of the kind of central focus for protecting civil rights and civil liberties. We need to understand the state of the courts in a very serious way, and kind of the state of the United States Supreme Court in particular as an avenue, and how much it has changed from 2017 to today. So I think also it's organizing, and it's, the types of ballot initiatives that we saw around reproductive freedom, and the work that organizers have been doing in communities to protect people's rights and access to fundamental freedoms. This is work that I think sometimes at law schools we train ourselves to kind of think of a particular set of tools as being the biggest priority for preserving social justice and protecting democracy and civil rights. And I just think that we have to, law school educators need to think about how we expand that, and that for the next 4 years, it is going to take a much broader set of tools than simply litigation in the courts, because of the state of those courts. So I think both looking at the states, looking at local and states, and thinking about other tools that we have at our disposal is going to be vital to being able to fight for civil rights and civil liberties.
Well, let me just turn one question to Ryan, and then we'll open it up for you all. Ryan, in my contact with American military officials, one of the striking things is the unique training that they have. That they're sent back into the universities, the high levels, have a real sense of mission and of kind of a solidarity and integrity to them, and that showed itself at various points in the first Trump administration. It showed itself at many points in American history in the post-war period. Do you think that's been eroded? Do you think that's still there? Is that something that we're going to see reassert itself in your view?
I don't know. So I think that there's a professionalism within the military, and certainly I think that there's a commitment to law among military lawyers and lawyers inside the Department of Defense. And I actually think that might be one of the most important breaks on illegal policies coming out of the White House. So, for example, if President Trump were to invoke the Insurrection Act, it's very hard to see how the courts are not going to either deny people standing or in other ways defer to national security judgment of the executive. But that is a separate matter from what should happen internally. It's kind of like Justice Kennedy's concurrence in Trump v. Hawaii, where the court gave the executive branch extraordinary deference over the Muslim ban because it was at the intersection of national security and immigration. And Justice Kennedy says in his concurrence, well, still it could be unconstitutional to engage in religiously discriminatory immigration policies internally. So it's almost like departmentalism, that internally lawyers should be that check. Sally Yates, in a certain sense, was that check because they know what's going on internally. Similarly, the Trump v. United States immunity decision says we can't look at a president's motivations for determining whether or not it's official versus private conduct and subject to criminal liability. But internally, there are lawyers who can look at the motivations. That's what they understand is going on when the decisions are being percolating up. So I do think that there are potentially lawyers internal to the Department of Defense and the U.S. Army and the like who should be looking to, in the invocation of the Insurrection Act, is it really a threat? Is it really that civil authorities are incapable of dealing with the concern? Is it that even if there is a threat, that the exercise of power is commensurate with and about that threat? So, for example, maybe there is a threat with Mexican criminal cartels. But that's not about everyday ordinary people who have crossed the border to find a life in the United States. So the implication of these extraordinary emergency powers being used for those purposes, I think there's a ways in which lawyers in the room can take certain policies hopefully off the table.
So if anybody wants to ask something of our panel, please feel free. You have to come up to the microphone on one side or the other of the room, and we have about 10, 12 minutes left. Go ahead, Mr. Miller.
Hi, I'm Max Miller. I'm a 3L. Thank you all for speaking today. One of the differences between 2017 and 2024 is a Supreme Court jurisprudence shifting towards skepticism of the administrative state, as exemplified by Loper Bright and company. So, you know, with the caveat that, you know, we are going to be litigating in the context of, you know, new Trump appointments to the bench, I'm curious what your take is on whether Loper Bright is perhaps an unforeseen tool, given that it is more restrictive of, you know, administrative leeway than Chevron.
So I'd like to turn this to Vanita, but I'll say one thing. I graduated from law school the year before Chevron, and I was taught by people who thought the most important tool, the most important administrative law case was a case called Vermont Yankee. And Vermont Yankee stands for the proposition that the agencies are slow to pick up the mandate given to them by Congress. And so it is absolutely critical that the courts intercede under the statutory mandate and not defer to the judgment of the agencies, which were thought to be, and this was during the Reagan period, they were thought to be a break on the administrative state. So, you know, this is like the nationwide injunction. What goes around comes around in many different ways. But Vanita, you really know this area best. What's your thought on whether taking away Chevron deference might be a way of challenging agency actions by less forward-looking agencies?
You know, it's I think in some ways, and I don't mean to be too cynical about this, it kind of depends on whether you believe that the court and courts are driven by kind of outcomes versus by the tools. I don't know. I wasn't actually very certain about, before President Trump was elected, about what the impact of Loper Bright would be. It was obviously a very concerning decision, but I also had been wondering, and I know I had several colleagues who had been questioning just exactly what its impact would be, practically speaking. And you know, it's now going to be interesting with a conservative majority court and federal agencies that are promulgating conservative regulations, et cetera, like, you know, what that looks like and how aggressive will the litigation be kind of post Loper Bright to dismantle the administrative state. This is an area where I think we're going to live into the answers. I perhaps am a little cynical because I feel like there has been so many examples of kind of outcome determinative decisions and a kind of outcome based set of rules from the courts recently. But I think we, you know, just thinking about all of this right now, I don't know what the answer is going to be, but I would not be surprised if the courts take a slightly more lenient view and exercise a little bit more deference to federal agencies, at least particular courts, conservative courts, and the like, for the next couple of years. We'll see.
Okay, so we have just very little time left. Let's try to take the two questions that we have.
Sorry, I'm short. My question picks up, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, my question picks up on something that Deborah said about the potential use of federal funding, or perhaps placing strings on federal funding to impose a federal policy agenda on states and local governments. I worked in New York City government during the last Trump administration, and toward the end, we started to see this, particularly with regard to immigration policy and federal grants to New York City. Most federal grants that I've ever seen have some provision, catch-all provision, that says that the grant is contingent on compliance with all applicable law. And so my question, I guess, is to what extent do you all see this happening in Trump 2, and how far could they take it? Does all applicable law include these types of executive orders? Could they expand it to other areas like education? Could they say there's no federal money to any school that educates non-citizens, or or that has a curriculum of XYZ? So yeah.
So
What do you guys
Deborah, why don't you take this, because the question is, the courts have treated the spending power as almost unlimited. And so, and your organization has litigated some of the most important spending clause cases. Do you see that as a point of resistance if executive authority is used through the spending power?
So you gave a specific example that I think is an example that we are concerned about, right? Withdrawing funding through the Department of Education to schools that are engaged in a certain type of education, schools that have policies that support transgender students, for example, and the hook would be that they're engaged in discrimination and therefore have lost eligibility for that funding. When I was talking about using funding at the state level, I'm talking about, can a state or locality forego that funding, right? So that they don't have to comply with things that they think are harmful to their citizens, or can they build up the resilience to not use that funding? Can we pledge to withhold state funding or state resources from state organizations that, unless they comply with state law that is more protective of citizens? So I don't want us to just think about funding in the context of, kind of that's the spending clause framework, or just in the context of Department of Education funding being withheld, or police funding being withheld if local police department is engaged in anything that kind of smells of defunding. But thinking even more affirmatively about how we can use funding within the state and localities to protect and kind of build up that firewall. That's what I was referring to.
So last question.
Thank you all again for being here. There are still 10 weeks left in the Biden administration. I'd be curious to hear from each of you, beyond what's been thrown around a lot, which is confirm as many judges as reasonably possible. What do you see as maybe like a number one priority that the administration should engage in anticipation of what we expect the Trump administration to do?
Ryan, you want to go first?
I think there's very little that can be done, especially just coming out of the executive branch alone. One idea might be that the Attorney General or OLC, but the OLC is very slow, were to promulgate a statement about what a president cannot ask a Justice Department to do because it would be in violation of laws in terms of selective prosecution or the like by going after political opponents. And it's so basic that maybe they could get that done in a week. But it's so basic that I think it might force the question of who would want to rescind such a thing, and then getting people around the table who would have to be necessary to sign off on some kind of modification of that or the like. Something about that as a break, because what Vanita said I think is right. I think it's wrong to underestimate the likelihood that President Trump will make good on some aspect of using the Justice Department to go after his perceived political enemies, because he did it before. There are multiple examples I've collected and published, written about, in which he specifically went after political opponents and got criminal investigations up and running through the use of his power.
So I would be derelict not to invoke our colleague Rachel Barco on this issue, because she is the longstanding advocate for the use of the clemency power And she would say that the one most powerful tool that President Biden has in the remaining time is precisely the clemency power, which can reach into policy questions, for example, commute all federal death sentences or something of that sort. So that's outside our domain here, but Deborah?
That's what I
you-
was going to say the same thing. I think that's would be number one, is commute the sentence of all the folks on federal death row. I mentioned that there was all this funding around the Department of Transportation rebuilding cities. They had lots of grant programs to kind of fortify communities that they haven't given out that money, to give away all that money before the turn of the year. All those grants should be given. There's lots of actions kind of held up within federal agencies that they can take quick action to resolve. My clinic has a challenge to a highway in South Carolina that the Department of Transportation opened an investigation. It's been pending for 3 years. If the highway is built, it's going to destroy a historic Black community, as highways have done over decades and decades. There's so many cases just like that still pending within federal agencies, and they can act quickly to try to move us closer and farther along towards some resolution. So I think those are some things that they can act quickly. But I will say, I like the question. I think it's important to think about what we can do in the short term. But in the long term, we have to start thinking about these solutions being long term. To borrow a line from the movie Dune, our plans are measured in centuries. This is going to take a long time to kind of fix, to shore up our communities, to repair our political system, our voting rights system, to really bring strength and equity to our communities and our organizations. And so my charge back to you all is to think long-term, to think creatively, to think expansively, that we shouldn't be thinking about this as a menu of options. You should be thinking about this as an invitation to use everything that you have learned in this building to do better, to be more creative, to move farther than we have been able to do in the past.
Okay, and then Vanita, you get the last word on the relationship between speed and getting things done fast and the federal government.
So let me take the short-term, long-term frame up. And I don't mean to poo-poo, I think OLC opinions are OLC opinions. When you have administrations willing to throw out norms, it's not clear to me that an OLC opinion, this is like maybe sand in gears type of situation. I think consent decrees are important because it takes the power to determine whether a particular set of remedies is in the hands of the executive branch. It puts it into the judicial branch. And I say this, when I left the Justice Department in 2017, Attorney General Sessions tried to get the department out of the Baltimore consent decree within, a month of him taking office. And it turned out that the Baltimore Police Commissioner, Baltimore Mayor, and it turns out the federal judge who had the consent decree lodged before him said, no, you're not going to do that. And so these are, there's a reason why consent decrees have power, and it's not just in the policing context, it's in a lot of other kind of civil rights contexts. We also, when I was associate AG, there was a consent decree around family separation and a set of rules around that. There's a consent decree around the use of federal law enforcement to manage protests. Like there are things in place that judges have purview over that are not going to be able to be dismantled at the whim of a new Justice Department administration. So those are some of the short-term things. I think it is important, as Deborah said, to think about the fact that this election obviously has, put a lot of all of this work in great jeopardy. But let us not delude ourselves that much of what may be accelerated now was in jeopardy before this election. And by that, I mean, are the crumbling kind of infrastructure and set of protections around voting rights, the concerns around criminal justice and criminal justice reform, the concerns around and accusations of the weaponization of the Justice Department and federal law enforcement. I mean, a lot of these things were the disinformation, the scourge of disinformation and the power of social media and the kind of undermining of policing and guardrails around social media. These are some of the big challenges that we are facing as a nation, the polarization, the kind of inability of people to believe that there actually is truth out there, et cetera. So I think we do the things in the short term, but I do think that there are some really big fundamental questions, and we are going to need broader coalitions to come on board with some of the things, some of these issues that we are talking about. And it is not going to be a fight won, even in 1 or 2 administrations. This is going to be the work for all of us moving forward. And it is going to require kind of serious reckoning, even among progressives and civil rights folks, but much more broadly around people who actually believe that there is a role for the federal government or for government to play in people's lives. But we have never had this quite right. And there's always been huge, serious inequities and structural problems in our democracy. And I do think in some ways we should become more laser focused than ever in really confronting some of these big challenges.
Okay, I think we are out of time. Please join me in thanking our panelists.